A regime that feels secure does not push surviving officials into public crowds so the country can watch them breathe. When Tehran's leaders started walking openly among supporters after weeks of targeted killings, that was not confidence on display. That was emergency theater, a state trying to prove continuity, because continuity itself had started to look doubtful. Then the deeper hit landed under the speeches. Iran's connection to the global internet fell to about 1% of pre-war levels, which means the capital is no longer just under attack from the outside. It is trying to fight, govern, hide damage, and control panic through near-total digital darkness. And while the signal layer was collapsing, parts of Tehran were losing power again and again under strike pressure. Once the capital starts taking repeated hits to both electricity and information at the same time, this stops being a story about damage alone. It becomes a story about whether Tehran can still absorb shock and answer it at speed. If you came here for the official version, this is the wrong channel. If you want the layer beneath the slogans, subscribe now. And in the comments, tell me the one thing you think Tehran is most desperate to keep unseen. The damage. The fear or the slowdown itself. People were crossing into Turkey just to get online and tell relatives they were still alive. That single fact destroys the safe version of this story, because a state whose civilians must leave the country for a signal is not simply managing wartime communications. It is operating inside a blackout so deep that the proof of life itself now requires a border crossing. That is the opening scene beneath the headline. Not a government in calm command of escalation, but a capital where signal is scarce, a power is unstable, surviving leaders are forced into visibility, and ordinary people have to leave the country just to speak. Once that is your baseline, every delay starts looking different. Because the title is not really about darkness, it is about drag. It is about the moment a war machine remains dangerous enough to strike, but loses the clean speed required to turn shock into coherent reply. That is when the public still hears threats. But inside the system, the response cycle starts sticking on itself. And a reply is not just a missile. A reply is the entire chain between impact and answer. Who gets the first report? Who trusts the report? Who carries it upward? Who survives long enough to sign off on it? Who transmits the order? Who synchronizes it? And who tells the country what it all means? If even a few links in that chain begin to fail together, the war starts freezing from the inside. Now add the strike that cuts closest to that chain, Majid Kadami, the head of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps intelligence organization, was reported killed on April 6th. That is not a symbolic death at the edge of the system. It lands inside one of the structures built to protect the regime, track threats, and understand what is happening before the next answer is even possible. So here is the central question the official statements cannot answer cleanly. Is Tehran slowing this war because it wants a tighter, more controlled response? Or because blackout and leadership shock have already started choking the system that produces the response? That question is the whole script. Because if the answer is the second one, then the danger is bigger than delay. A slowed system can still retaliate. A slowed system can still escalate. A slowed system can still kill. What it struggles to do is retaliate on time, escalate with clarity, and kill without compounding its own confusion. That is why delayed response is not a comfort signal. It is often the exact opposite. And this is the part most war coverage gets wrong. People think a state is either in control or collapsing. Real systems break in uglier ways than that. They keep moving, keep threatening, keep punishing, keep denying weakness, while the gears inside them grind harder and hotter every day. Open source assessment has already gone much further than the speeches do. Decapitation strikes were assessed as likely causing shock and confusion inside Iran's internal security apparatus, which means the damage is not trapped at the top of the hierarchy. It has started bleeding downward into the machinery meant to stabilize the regime while the regime is under fire. And that phrase, shock and confusion, matters more than it sounds. It means someone somewhere is getting reports late, doubting reports they do get, improvising around dead or missing superiors, and making decisions inside a fog thicker than the one the public sees. Once that happens, The state does not stop functioning. It starts functioning through compression. Compression is when the system narrows everything at once. Fewer channels, fewer trusted voices. Fewer people allowed to speak, fewer people allowed to know. More political filtering, more emergency theatre, more pressure on the surviving core to look stable, even while stability is what they are running out of. That is why the blackout matters far beyond censorship. It does not just hide damage from the public, it changes how fast bad news can move, who is allowed to carry it, and how much of reality reaches the people trying to decide what Iran's next move should be. Once visibility becomes selective, speed becomes selective too. The communications collapse was also never a simple one-direction story. Analysts warned that the near-total blackout likely reflected both state suppression and external cyber disruption, meaning Tehran may be blinding its own society while hostile. Actors are also stressing the signal environment from the outside. That is not just information control, it is a contested battlefield inside the network itself. And once the network becomes part of the battlefield, delay stops being just a political decision. It becomes a systems problem. Messages move slower, verification gets harder, mistrust grows faster. The time between event and answer stretches, and in wartime, that stretch can be fatal. This is where the title's promise turns real. Tehran's blackout slows every reply because replies are made of information before they are made of force. If the information arrives late, filtered, incomplete, or politically sanitized, the response may still come, but it comes heavier, dirtier, and less certain than before. That is why you should be suspicious of any clean narrative right now. Tehran wants delay to look deliberate. Its enemies want delay to look like decisive success. But what the evidence keeps pointing toward is messier and more dangerous. A capital still dangerous enough to fight, while increasingly forced to fight through interruption. And then came the admission that strips away the last polite excuse. Access was being preserved for those who could get the voice out, which means connectivity itself was being distributed politically. Tehran was not just trying to survive a communications emergency. It was deciding whose voice counts while the rest of the country sank deeper into managed darkness. That single detail should hit like a hammer. Because once access depends on who is trusted to speak for the state, every layer above it starts bending too. Which failures are hidden, which strikes are downplayed, which delays are reframed as strategy, which internal fractures never travel upward in their original form. A regime can survive external pressure longer than people think. What it cannot survive cleanly is internal distortion. The moment leadership starts receiving politically safe versions of reality instead of reality itself, command quality begins to rot from inside, even if the missiles still launch on time once in a while. And rotting command does not make a war smaller. It makes it meaner. Because a state that feels blind, exposed, and internally strained often reaches for the same answer again and again. Tighten, control, narrow visibility, punish doubt, and hold the center together long enough to choose the next strike from a smaller, more loyal circle. That choice carries a direct human cost. Internet shutdowns during active crisis restrict access to life-saving information, which means civilians lose time, lose warning, lose contact, and lose the ability to tell what danger is real and what danger is already moving toward them. A government willing to impose that cost is telling you exactly what it prioritizes first. And what it prioritizes first is not just secrecy. It is control over tempo. If civilians are blind, panic is easier to suppress. If images do not escape, damage is easier to downplay. If approved voices dominate, the story is easier to discipline. But if all of that comes at the price of slower, narrower, less trusted information flows inside the country, then the same blackout, protecting the regime, can also start degrading the regime. That is the trap. Tehran may believe it is reducing chaos. In reality, it may be trading public visibility for internal drag. The country goes darker, the chain of command gets tighter, the approved channels get fewer. And every reply becomes more dependent on a shrinking circle of trusted people who are themselves under assassination pressure. And that is before you even factor in the grid. Because once repeated outages start shadowing the capital as well, the pressure stops being abstract. It enters the city's daily operating pulse. It enters movement, reassurance, logistics, and the ordinary assumptions that make a capital feel governable, even under war. Several neighborhoods in Karaj, Alborz province, and Tehran experienced power outages on March 29th, with reports tying the disruption to the strike environment around Parchin east of the capital. Once communications, pressure, and electrical, the pressure begin overlapping around Tehran. The response system is no longer merely stressed, it is being made operationally heavier at the center. That is a huge difference. A state can hide bomb damage on television. It cannot hide from the internal consequences of trying to manage a war through power interruptions, selective connectivity, leadership churn, and public fear all at once. So even if the outward language remains defiant, the inward experience of running the war becomes more fragmented by the day. And fragmented systems do something very dangerous after they hesitate. They overcorrect. The longer a regime feels it is being watched for weakness, the more likely it is to turn the next answer into a demonstration. Not because the answer is strategically clean, but because the regime needs to prove to enemies, citizens, and its own factions that the machine is still fully alive. That is why freezing the war does not mean calming the war. It means freezing the smoothness of decision, freezing the confidence of command, freezing the reliability of the relay between what happened and what the state can do about it. The war keeps moving. What freezes is the state's ability to move through it cleanly. That is also why leadership kills do not give easy answers. They can remove experienced figures without removing the system's will to fight, which means the void may be filled by harder, less tested, more reactive personalities rather than calmer ones. The state can become weaker in structure while becoming angrier in behavior, and that combination is one of the most dangerous in war. So if you are waiting for this story to resolve into one clean conclusion, here it is. Tehran may still have the means to hit back, but there is mounting evidence that it is no longer processing the war through the same stable architecture it wants the world to imagine. The speed, trust, and visibility required for clean retaliation are all under stress at once. That is the real meaning of leadership shock. Not just dead officials, not just reshuffles, not just propaganda. Leadership shock is what happens when every surviving decision maker suddenly has to operate in the shadow of removal, replacement, interruption, and political filtering. At that point, even a functioning state starts behaving like a wounded one. And wounded states do not always go quiet. Sometimes they go darker first. They reduce visibility, centralize voice, perform control in public, and try to buy time until the next move can be made, from a position that looks deliberate instead of damaged. That is what Tehran increasingly appears to be doing. Now, inside Tehran, civilians were already asking the question that marks a war entering a darker phase. How long can the capital function if power plants are hit and bridges are taken out? Once people begin measuring the conflict through blackout duration, escape routes, water transport, and the physical survivability of the city, the war is no longer living only in military targets. It is pressing directly against the state's ability to keep daily life attached to its authority. That is the point where every delay becomes loaded. Because if infrastructure pressure rises while the regime is already fighting through blackout and leadership shock, then any pause in response can be read in three different ways at once. Citizens read fear, enemies read weakness, leaders inside the system read pressure to prove otherwise. That is the recipe for the next move becoming bigger than the last one. So yes, Tehran may be slowing by choice in some places. It may be trying to preserve survival, limit exposure, and hold escalation in reserve. But even if that is true, the conditions under which that choice is being made are themselves part of the damage. A choice made through darkness, filtered voice, and leadership shock is not the same as a choice made from stability. And if the slowdown is not fully a choice, then the implication is colder still. It means blackout and leadership shock are already doing exactly what the title says. They're slowing every reply, not by ending Tehran's capacity to fight, but by degrading the system that turns capacity into usable action. Come back to the border for a second. If ordinary people have to cross mountains into another country just to send a message home, then the capital they left behind is not managing the war from strength. It is asking an entire society to live inside a silence so heavy that even human presence has to be verified from outside the country. And that silence is not separate from the war anymore. It is one of the ways the war is now being fought, absorbed, and mismanaged. It hides damage, yes. It protects the regime, maybe. But it also slows truth, slows trust, slows relay. Slows certainty, and in a crisis that means it slows every reply that depends on those things. So the official story will keep repeating unity, resilience, and resolve. But the evidence points somewhere harsher. Tehran is not simply dark. It is dark in the precise places a war cannot afford to be dark for long. Trusted speed, clean continuity, and unfiltered visibility. That is why the war feels frozen without feeling over. And that is the final answer to the title. Tehran's blackout is not just hiding the war. It is becoming part of the mechanism to choking the response cycle, while leadership shock keeps knocking weight onto the same stressed system. The state can still threaten, still strike, still punish, but it is doing it through a capital that increasingly looks less like a command center and more like a regime trying to keep its nerve while the wiring burns behind the walls. Stay here. This channel follows the moment governments stop controlling the story and start leaking the truth through their panic.